Good day. I'm Larry C. Johnson. When a defensive line collapses in war, it rarely collapses gradually. It collapses suddenly. And when it does, it exposes forces that have been deteriorating beneath the surface for months. The fall of Pokrovsk is not an isolated battlefield setback. It is the outward manifestation of a deeper structural disintegration inside Ukraine's war effort. The illusion of Western strategy. For 2 years, the West insisted that Ukrainian determination, Western funding, and NATO weapons could somehow offset Russia's overwhelming advantages in manpower, industrial output, artillery, electronic warfare, and layered defensive depth. But wars of attrition are not decided by rhetoric. They are decided by endurance. Pokrovsk demonstrates that Ukraine's endurance has reached its limit. This retreat did not unfold as an organized, phased withdrawal. It unfolded as fragmentation. Units became cut off, communication degraded, commanders lost the ability to reinforce weak points or coordinate movement. Soldiers attempted to escape through narrow tree lines and agricultural corridors because main routes had already fallen under Russian fire control. Most of these escape attempts were destroyed by drones and artillery. What happened at Pokrovsk was not repositioning. It was collapse under sustained pressure, material, structural, and psychological. The psychological break. Once a unit realizes that reinforcements will not arrive, ammunition is insufficient, evacuation is impossible, and command structures are weakening, cohesion disintegrates. Not because soldiers are cowards, but because the framework that sustains discipline has broken. Pokrovsk is the point at which battlefield stress exceeded Ukraine's ability to absorb it. Western governments once portrayed Pokrovsk as part of a stable defensive belt protecting the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk urban complex. The assumption was that this line could hold indefinitely. But war does not respect narratives. The battlefield tells its own story. When Pokrovsk fell, it signaled that Ukraine's eastern defensive architecture is not merely under pressure, it is unraveling. Ukraine no longer has the reserves needed to rotate exhausted units off the line. It is consuming its remaining fighting force faster than it can regenerate it. Russia, by contrast, is fighting a slow, methodical war of attrition designed to wear the enemy down rather than achieve dramatic breakthroughs. This is why Russia advances even when progress looks incremental. Each step forward reflects cumulative degradation on the Ukrainian side. The strategic turning point. The fall of Pokrovsk marks the moment when battlefield reality diverges so sharply from political rhetoric that it can no longer be disguised by declarations of resolve or promises of future support. Statements cannot rebuild forces that no longer exist. Speeches cannot create ammunition that has already been spent. Wars end when one side can no longer maintain the structure required to fight. That structure is now fracturing. Pokrovsk is not the end of the war, but it is the beginning of the end of Ukraine's ability to wage it on the terms it once believed were possible. The counteroffensive myth? From the beginning, Western planners placed enormous faith in a decisive Ukrainian counteroffensive. They believed that Western training, precision weapons, and intelligence could overcome structural disadvantages in manpower and industry. This belief was not rooted in military reality. It was rooted in hope. Western doctrine was designed for expeditionary wars, wars fought against inferior opponents under Western air supremacy. Ukraine never possessed that advantage. Russia built layered defenses, minefields, trench networks, interlocking fire zones, pre-registered artillery grids, and drone surveillance extending deep into Ukrainian staging areas. These were not improvisations. They were the product of years of combat experience. Ukraine attempted to attack these defenses with mechanized formations trained under Western assumptions. Without air superiority, mechanized forces became exposed and vulnerable. The results were catastrophic. When mechanized assaults failed, Ukraine shifted to infantry-led attacks, turning the operation into a pure attritional battle, one that Russia was structurally built to win. The counteroffensive was not only a military failure, It was a strategic miscalculation. It exhausted Ukraine's best trained brigades, depleted its ammunition, and left gaps filled by mobilized recruits with minimal training. From that moment forward, Ukraine was no longer shaping the war. Ukraine was reacting to it. The Russian method: encirclement through attrition. Western observers repeatedly misread Russian strategy, expecting blitzkrieg-style operations. Instead, Russia pursued a methodical campaign of open cauldrons, not fully closed pockets, but restricted zones where supply lines narrowed. Reinforcement corridors became lethal. Retreat routes fell under fire control. Mobility became suicide. Pokrovsk was an open cauldron long before its defensive line collapsed. Russia does not need rapid breakthroughs. It needs Ukraine to run out of men and equipment. Russia fights with patience. Ukraine fights against a clock. Every day of attrition advantages Russia. The decisive factor: wars of attrition are decided by demographics and industrial capacity. Ukraine is running out of both. The original Ukrainian army, motivated volunteers, trained soldiers, cohesive brigades, is gone. Its replacements are often civilians rushed into battle with minimal training. Ukraine no longer has the reserves to rotate units. Fatigue compounds, casualties accelerate, cohesion dissolves. Russia, meanwhile, trains and rotates its troops, integrating new soldiers gradually while maintaining operational pressure. Ukraine cannot match this pace. Morale erodes not when soldiers lose hope of victory, but when they lose faith in the structure that sustains them. At Pokrovsk, that structure collapsed. The political crisis behind the battlefield. Kyiv cannot publicly acknowledge this collapse. It must maintain the illusion of stability to preserve foreign aid and internal cohesion. Western leaders faced their own crisis. They tied their credibility to the belief that Ukraine would win. They insisted that Russia was collapsing under sanctions, that Ukrainian breakthroughs were imminent, that time favored Kyiv. Each of these assumptions has now been disproven by events. The panic emerging in Washington is not about Ukraine's fate. It is about the West losing control over its own narrative. Western governments must now choose between escalating a losing strategy or accepting limits and shifting toward negotiations. Neither option is politically comfortable. The failure of NATO planning. NATO planners projected the logic of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and the Balkans onto a peer-to-peer conflict. This was a fundamental error. Those wars were fought against inferior opponents with no industrial base, no air defense, and limited ability to contest the battle space. Ukraine is the opposite. Russia is the opposite. Western doctrine, without air superiority, collapses. Russia exploited this mismatch ruthlessly. The counteroffensive failed not because Ukraine fought poorly, but because the plan itself was impossible given conditions on the battlefield. The war's final phase. The fall of Pokrovsk marks a transition. Ukraine is no longer shaping events. It is attempting to prevent collapse. The next defensive line, the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk complex, is Ukraine's last major fortified zone in Donbass. If that line falls, Ukraine loses not only territory, but the industrial base required to coordinate sustained operations. Diplomatically, both sides are moving toward an inevitable negotiation phase. But negotiations do not occur when one side believes it can win. They occur when the cost of continuing exceeds the cost of ending. Ukraine is approaching that threshold. Russia can afford to wait. The West cannot admit it. The tragedy. The tragedy is not simply that Ukraine is losing the war. The tragedy is that Ukraine was encouraged to pursue a strategy that made this outcome inevitable. It was pushed to reject negotiations early when its bargaining position was stronger, and instead was promised a victory that was never achievable under material reality. After Pokrovsk, the war will not end with a sudden collapse. It will end with steady erosion, a retreat here, a withdrawal there, until the line finally breaks. The map will change slowly, and then all at once. Wars do not end when politicians admit defeat. They end when reality forces recognition. That moment is approaching. Hi, everyone. I'm Larry C. Johnson. What you've just heard me lay out over the past weeks and months runs completely opposite to what most Americans are being told by their government and by the mainstream media. In the West, we are told Ukraine is holding, Russia is cracking, sanctions are working, Moscow is isolated and on the verge of collapse. But when you actually look at reality on the ground, when you speak with people inside Russia, when you talk to frontline commanders, soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary citizens, you see a very different picture. Russia's situation versus Ukraine's collapse. Inside Russia, what I see and hear is this. The economy is functioning. Refineries hit by Ukrainian drones are repaired quickly. There are no gas lines, no panic. Civil society is coherent, not disintegrating. People are united behind the leadership and behind the goal of victory, not because of propaganda posters, but because they view this as an existential struggle imposed on them. They want peace, yes. But every single time I ask them in what order, the answer is always the same. First victory, then peace. On the other side, we have Ukraine. Here's the reality. Ukraine's best brigades, including NATO-trained, well-equipped elite units, are being ground down in cauldrons and pockets from which they will not return. There are entire formations now either surrounded, destroyed, or in the process of being cut off. The Ukrainian government is drowning in corruption scandals. Ministers have been forced to resign for stealing money, and everyone else is busy grabbing what they can before the ship sinks. Cities are going dark. Russia has systematically destroyed most of Ukraine's power generation. Infrastructure is failing. Winter is coming, and there is no realistic way to fix this in time. This is not a stable situation. This is political collapse and societal collapse in slow motion. The Western narrative versus battlefield reality. For 2 years, Western leaders have tied their credibility to one big idea. Ukraine is winning, Russia is failing, and if we just send one more package of aid, victory is inevitable. They insisted Russia was isolated, sanctions would break the Russian economy. Russian casualties were unsustainable. A decisive Ukrainian counteroffensive would break Russian lines. None of that has happened. Russia has expanded arms production, stabilized its economy, adapted militarily and technologically, maintained internal political cohesion. Ukraine, meanwhile, has burned through its best men, lost critical infrastructure, become dependent on a flow of Western aid that is politically fragile, reached the point where it can no longer rotate units, can no longer adequately train replacements, and can no longer pretend that it controls the operational tempo of the war. The fall of cities like Pokrovsk is not a local setback. It is a symptom of structural failure. When a defensive line collapses, it doesn't melt slowly, it snaps. And when it snaps, it reveals months of hidden deterioration underneath NATO's strategic failure. One of the great unspoken truths of this conflict is that NATO designed a war Ukraine could never sustain. Western planners tried to import doctrines from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and the Balkans into a conflict against a peer adversary with real air defense, real industry, real artillery mass, real electronic warfare, and a real ability to hit back. Those previous wars were expeditionary. Ukraine is industrial war. In industrial war, the fundamentals are brutally simple. Manpower, artillery, production capacity, logistics. On every one of those axes, Russia has depth that Ukraine simply does not. Western intelligence, superiority, satellite imagery, and real-time targeting don't win wars by themselves. They are multipliers, not substitutes. If you don't have enough men, enough shells, enough armor, and enough time, no amount of targeting data will save you. The result of this mismatch, the much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive failed. Ukraine lost its best-equipped mechanized formations attacking into layered Russian defenses. After that, Ukraine stopped shaping the war and started reacting to it. From that point on, the outcome became a question of when, not if. The off-ramp problem for Washington. This brings us to the uncomfortable question. If the reality is what I've just described, Ukraine losing, Russia stabilizing, the West running out of options, what is the off-ramp for Washington? The answer is simple. There is no honest off-ramp. So here is what will likely happen. Privately, Western governments will concede that Ukraine cannot win on the battlefield. Many of them already know this. Publicly, they will shift language from victory to peace, from defeat Russia to responsible diplomacy, from we will support Ukraine as long as it takes to we must seek a just and lasting settlement. They will blame Ukraine for corruption, for mismanagement, for not mobilizing enough men, anything to avoid admitting that the original strategy was fatally flawed. They will try to reframe defeat as success. We strengthened NATO. We degraded Russian military capability. We stood up for democracy. The truth is that Russia will dictate the military terms of the endgame. Ukraine will be forced to accept a settlement from a position of weakness. The West will spin retreat as maturity or realism, but it will not change the map. What kind of Russia emerges? A lot of people in the West comfort themselves with the idea that even if Ukraine loses, Russia will be exhausted, weakened, and internally fragile when this is over. I don't see that. What I see is a Russia that has hardened under pressure, a Russia that has restructured its economy for sanctions resistance, a Russia that has modernized its military the hard way through contact, adaptation, and learning, a Russia that is now deeply skeptical of any Western assurances or security arrangements. In other words, the Russia that emerges from this war will not be more compliant. It will be more independent, more experienced, and more convinced that it must rely on itself and a handful of non-Western partners. The real tragedy. The tragedy here is not merely that Ukraine is losing the war. The tragedy is that Ukraine was encouraged, pushed, and manipulated into pursuing a strategy that made this outcome almost unavoidable. Early negotiations were discouraged or sabotaged. Maximalist goals, full territorial restoration, strategic defeat of Russia were promoted. Every time Ukraine had a chance to bargain from relative strength, it was told to keep going, to reject compromise, to believe that one more wave of weapons would change everything. Now, after Pokrovsk and other collapses, the war enters its final phase, not dramatic, sudden defeat, but steady erosion. A retreat here, a withdrawal there. Defensive lines bending and then breaking. The map will change slowly and then all at once. Wars don't end when politicians admit defeat. Wars end when material reality forces recognition. That moment is coming. I'm Larry C. Johnson. Thank you for listening.